Ardelia Vaughn built a billion-dollar empire proving she never needed anyone. But the morning she found two abandoned boys at her gate, she realized someone had been watching her for decades. The boys didn't cry. They didn't knock. They just stood there like they knew she wouldn't turn them away. And inside the envelope left beside them was something far more disturbing than a handwritten plea. There was proof of payment. Someone had already wired money into her account for taking them. And when her team traced the source, it led back to a sealed foster care file from 25 years ago. The same year an 8-year-old girl named Ardelia almost disappeared into a system no one talks about. The question wasn't who left the boys. The question was who almost bought her. Atlanta woke slowly that morning, the sky still holding onto the last shade of indigo before dawn softened it into gray. The Vaughn estate stood silent behind wrought iron gates, its white stone facade untouched by the noise of the outside world. Everything about the property reflected intention, trimmed hedges measured to symmetry, security lights dimmed by programmed precision, imported marble steps polished to a mirror shine. Ardelia Vaughn had built her empire on control, and her home reflected the same principle: nothing out of place, nothing unpredictable, nothing owed. The envelope did not belong there. It rested at the center of the top marble step, small and painfully ordinary against the grandeur surrounding it. No courier mark, no return address, just her name written in careful black ink. The stillness of the property made its presence louder than any alarm. Inside the gates, nothing happened without authorization. Security discovered it first, alerted by motion sensors that recorded activity just before sunrise. The footage showed a single vehicle pulling up beyond camera range. A hooded figure stepped forward briefly, leaving something at the gate before retreating into darkness. The image blurred at the exact moment a face might have been captured. The timing felt intentional. By the time Ardelia stepped outside, dressed for a morning of investor calls, the envelope had already been placed in her hands. She did not rush. She never rushed. Her life had been engineered to avoid reaction. But when she opened the flap and unfolded the letter inside, the architecture of her calm shifted almost invisibly. The note was handwritten, direct, precise. It explained that two boys, Silas Reed, age 10, and Micah Reed, age 7, had been left at her gate. It claimed they had no one. It stated that compensation had already been arranged. Attached was a printed confirmation of a wire transfer, an initial deposit large enough to draw suspicion but small enough to seem like an installment. The language was transactional, detached, as if arranging delivery of assets. Ardelia looked past the gates then and saw them. They stood near the iron bars, two small figures framed by the vastness of manicured property. Silas stood slightly in front, shoulders squared with protective tension far older than his years. Micah remained close beside him, clutching a thin, worn paperback against his chest. Neither cried. Neither knocked. They waited. Wealth and abandonment had never stood so close together. The final line of the letter drew her attention back to the page. You survived because someone chose you. Now it's your turn. The words did not accuse. They reminded, and for the first time in years, Ardelia Vaughn felt something she had long ago disciplined out of her life, memory pressing against the surface. Ardelia Vaughn did not believe in accidents. She believed in leverage, preparation, and strategic patience. Long before Vanguard Neural Systems became a dominant force in adaptive intelligence software. Before financial magazines placed her on their covers as one of the most formidable self-made billionaires in America, she had learned a simpler truth: whoever controls the outcome controls the story. That belief had shaped every decision she made, every partnership she accepted, every acquisition she executed without hesitation. Publicly, she was described as disciplined, visionary, and emotionally impenetrable. Analysts admired her refusal to over-explain. Competitors feared her silence more than her statements. In boardrooms, she listened longer than anyone else, then spoke with surgical precision. She had built a technology empire from a single rented office and a prototype no investor initially understood. She outmaneuvered rivals twice her age and 10 times her resources. She did not inherit influence. She constructed it. Privately, however, her success rested on something less admirable and more fragile. Ardelia believed survival depended on detachment. She had entered foster care at 8 years old with a single trash bag of clothes and a promise she whispered only to herself: never again. Never again would she rely on someone who could disappear. Never again would she attach her future to anyone's promises. Independence became armor. Wealth became insulation. Control became oxygen. Compassion in her mind complicated leverage. Emotion blurred judgment. She had seen what happened to children who waited for rescue that never came. She decided early that she would rescue herself instead. That decision fueled her rise, but it also narrowed her world into something efficient and solitary. There had been one moment years ago when she almost fractured that rule. After Vanguard's first major acquisition, she hired a private investigator to locate her biological mother. The search uncovered fragments, an address, a court record, and then a sealed juvenile case file referencing a trafficking investigation tied to multiple foster placements. The file was locked by court order. The investigator advised caution. Ardelia chose distance. She closed the inquiry and redirected her focus to expansion, convincing herself that the past held no strategic value. Now, standing behind the security glass of her estate and watching two boys wait without speaking, she felt an old instinct surface. Silas Reed did not fidget. He did not plead. He stood alert, scanning the property with measured awareness. It was not defiance in his posture, it was calculation. The kind born from instability. The kind she once carried like a shield. The last name Reed lingered in her thoughts longer than it should have. Familiar, though she could not immediately place it. Upstairs, her executive assistant worked quietly through the financial trace attached to the envelope's receipt. When the call finally came through, the voice on the other end carried something uncharacteristically uncertain. The originating account, she explained, had been routed through a defunct charitable foundation, one that had operated within the same foster network Ardelia had passed through decades earlier. Silas Reed carried himself like someone who had already learned the cost of trusting too quickly. He observed the Vaughn estate the way other children might study a storm approaching across an open field, quietly, calculating distance and risk. His shoulders remained squared, his movements deliberate, never wandering too far from his younger brother. Adults in his experience operated on conditions. Promises shifted. Addresses changed. Stability expired without warning. Hyper-awareness had become his discipline, and discipline was the only form of safety he recognized. Micah stood differently. Where Silas projected vigilance, Micah folded inward. His small hands gripped a worn paperback Bible, its edges softened from repeated handling. He did not clutch it for performance or attention. He held it as though it were proof that something constant still existed. His eyes moved across the mansion's tall windows and polished columns without wonder. Luxury did not impress him. It unsettled him. When the gates opened and staff invited them inside, Micah hesitated at the threshold, his feet anchored to stone. The mansion's grandeur seemed less like shelter and more like another unfamiliar system with rules he did not yet understand. Background inquiries unfolded quickly under Ardelia's directive. Records showed that the boys had crossed 3 state lines in 2 years, transferred through temporary guardianships that dissolved as abruptly as they formed. Each relocation had been justified through paperwork that appeared legitimate on the surface. Beneath it, inconsistencies surfaced, financial reimbursements larger than standard foster allowances, deposits categorized as administrative stipends. Their mother, Talia Reed, had been reported missing 6 months earlier. No confirmed sightings, no official declaration of death, just absence. Authorities had previously flagged similar patterns, vulnerable children placed under informal guardianship arrangements in exchange for private payments. The language used in the envelope mirrored terminology from those flagged cases. The system did not openly condone exploitation, but it struggled to prevent those who learned how to maneuver within its blind spots. Ardelia's legal counsel responded with efficiency rather than sentiment. They advised immediate coordination with state services to avoid liability. Harboring minors under ambiguous legal status exposed her to reputational and financial risk. In corporate terms, the solution was simple: transfer responsibility and insulate the company from association. Her board expected prudence, not emotional investment. Complication arrived sooner than anticipated. A neighboring property owner leaked early morning security footage to a local journalist. Within hours, speculation circulated across digital platforms. Headlines framed the situation in competing narratives: philanthropic rescue or strategic publicity. Commentators questioned motives. Investors monitored volatility. The boys, who had arrived in silence, now existed inside a public debate. Ardelia understood competition. She understood scrutiny. What she had not anticipated was how quickly the decision would cease to be private. Micah's refusal to step fully inside lingered in her thoughts. Wealth had insulated her from instability, yet to him it signaled another unknown variable. Late that afternoon, her forensic accountant delivered a new report. The initial wire transfer listed in the envelope was not a one-time incentive. Automated scheduling indicated additional installments queued for release, conditional upon continued custody. The first anonymous message arrived before noon. It was brief, professionally written, and void of emotion. It advised Ardelia Vaughn to exercise discretion and warned that further inquiry into the boy's background could destabilize existing partnerships. The language was careful, almost courteous, but the implication was unmistakable. Someone with reach believed her curiosity was inconvenient. By afternoon, the pressure multiplied. 2 board members requested an emergency call, citing market instability. Vanguard Neural Systems had spent years cultivating investor confidence built on predictability and disciplined expansion. Now headlines were linking the company's founder to an unfolding guardianship controversy. Analysts speculated about reputational exposure. Share prices dipped modestly but noticeably. Investors did not fear children, they feared uncertainty. Ardelia listened to the concerns without interruption. She understood the calculus. In purely strategic terms, the solution remained simple: cooperate with state agencies, detach from the situation, issue a controlled statement about temporary humanitarian assistance. The market would stabilize within days. Her empire would remain intact, but new information complicated the equation. The private background review initiated by her office uncovered patterns that refused to remain coincidental. Multiple children within the same foster network had been transferred through loosely monitored guardianships, each accompanied by structured financial incentives. Payments flowed through shell nonprofits, then dissolved into private accounts. The design was sophisticated enough to appear compliant while masking profit beneath administrative language. It was exploitation disguised as benevolence. Helping Silas and Micah was no longer an isolated act of charity. It intersected with a system that appeared to monetize abandonment. The moral cost sharpened. If she stepped away, she preserved Vanguard's dominance and reinforced the identity she had curated for decades: controlled, detached, unshakable. If she pursued the truth, she risked exposing connections that might circle back to her own past. Her childhood file, long sealed and conveniently forgotten, suddenly felt less like closure and more like an omission. Another anonymous warning followed, this one less polished. It implied consequences extending beyond financial markets. The message did not specify harm, it suggested disruption. Partnerships revisited, contracts re-examined, influence exercised. Ardelia authorized escalation. She retained Grayson Hale, a former federal analyst known for tracing financial irregularities that others overlooked. His reputation rested on patience and pattern recognition rather than theatrics. Within 48 hours, he mapped transactional routes linking the boy's deposit to a defunct charitable organization that had once operated inside the same foster network Ardelia had moved through as a child. The revelation unsettled her more than the threats. Records indicated that her own juvenile case file had been sealed by legal petition from that organization decades earlier. The justification cited administrative privacy. The timing aligned too neatly to dismiss. Compassion, once framed as liability, now threatened to unravel the narrative she had built about her survival. She had believed she escaped through discipline alone. If the same network had shaped her path, then her independence was not as absolute as she claimed. Late that evening, Grayson transmitted archived footage recovered from court storage. The grainy recording dated back 25 years. In the background of a routine transfer between foster placements, a young girl stood partially obscured by adults moving paperwork across a table. The girl's face, though blurred by time, was unmistakably hers. The archived footage did not raise its voice, yet it dismantled a lifetime of certainty. The grainy recording showed a narrow office with fluorescent lighting and metal filing cabinets pressed against pale walls. Adults moved papers across a desk with mechanical efficiency. In the corner of the frame stood a thin 8-year-old girl with guarded eyes and rigid posture, watching every exchange as though memorizing it. Ardelia Vaughn recognized the stance immediately. It was the posture of a child preparing for removal. Grayson Hale's analysis filled in what the footage could not. Financial logs from that same year revealed a scheduled guardianship transfer tied to a private foundation operating within the foster network. The payment category mirrored the language used in the deposit attached to Silas and Micah. Administrative facilitation, placement adjustment. The terminology disguised intention. Ardelia had not been formally adopted through that channel, but the paperwork showed her name listed in preliminary routing documents before the transfer was abruptly voided. Someone had intervened. The cancellation had been authorized at the final hour by an unidentified party whose signature was redacted in every surviving record. The foundation withdrew its petition and her file was sealed within weeks. Official explanation cited clerical irregularities. Unofficially, the pattern aligned too closely with the boys' situation to ignore. Ardelia had not escaped the system solely through resilience. She had been removed from a transaction. The realization fractured the mythology she had built around herself. For decades, she framed her ascent as proof that isolation bred strength. She had believed that discipline alone carried her from instability to influence. Now the evidence suggested an unseen interruption had altered her trajectory. Her survival was not entirely self-engineered. It was, at least in part, chosen. Across the estate, the boys adjusted in quiet increments. Silas no longer scanned every hallway before entering a room. Structure softened his vigilance, though he still observed more than he spoke. Micah spent hours at a long oak desk overlooking the gardens, sketching in careful strokes. Recently, his drawings had begun to include the outline of a woman without a face, positioned between two smaller figures. The absence of detail carried more weight than expression would have. It suggested presence without certainty. Ardelia found herself lingering longer near them, studying the cautious trust forming in subtle gestures. Attachment had always represented vulnerability in her calculations. Now detachment felt like repetition of harm. She authorized a substantial public investment into child advocacy initiatives, reframing the narrative from personal controversy to systemic reform. The market reacted cautiously but stabilized as public sentiment shifted. The threats, however, intensified in tone. Warnings referenced political alliances and financial entanglements reaching beyond charitable fronts. Grayson traced overlapping donor records and uncovered a name threaded through both Ardelia's sealed case and Talia Reed's disappearance. Ezekiel Crown, a prominent political donor with federal influence and long-standing ties to the same foundation that once petitioned control over her file. The deeper Grayson Hale traced the financial pathways, the clearer the architecture became. What first appeared to be isolated irregularities resolved into a coordinated network operating behind respectable language and polished branding. Children moved through loosely supervised guardianships, while administrative stipends traveled through shell charities that dissolved as quickly as they were registered. The pattern relied not on overt criminality but on complexity. Transactions were layered, redistributed, and reframed as operational expenses. Accountability blurred inside paperwork. At the center of multiple pathways sat entities connected to Ezekiel Crown's philanthropic foundation. Publicly, the organization promoted child welfare reform and family stabilization initiatives. Privately, its financial arms intersected with the same routing accounts tied to Sila's and Micah's installment schedule. The sophistication suggested insulation by design. Crown himself remained legally distant from direct signatures, yet his influence threaded consistently through advisory boards and funding councils. As investigative whispers reached financial media, Vanguard Neural Systems felt the impact. An anonymous source leaked a narrative suggesting Ardelia had knowingly accepted funds connected to questionable guardianship incentives. The framing implied complicity rather than discovery. Within hours, market confidence faltered. Stock value dipped sharply, not because of proven wrongdoing but because uncertainty unsettles capital faster than truth restores it. The board convened under strain. Several directors argued that Ardelia's continued visibility in the investigation endangered shareholder trust. A temporary resignation, they suggested, would protect the company from reputational bleed. The proposal was framed as strategic distancing rather than condemnation. Step aside, stabilize, return later. Ardelia recognized the maneuver. It was the same logic she once applied to emotional risk, detach before damage spreads. Yet stepping away now would validate the implication that she had something to conceal. More importantly, it would abandon the boys to a system already proven porous. Instead of retreating, she escalated transparency. Against legal caution, she authorized the public release of her sealed childhood records, including documentation of the voided guardianship transfer and the Foundation's petition. The disclosure reframed her position overnight. She was no longer a billionaire entangled in scandal. She was a former foster child whose file intersected with a network now under scrutiny. Public sentiment recalibrated. Media narratives shifted from suspicion to inquiry. Privately, federal investigators requested additional statements. Silas, composed beyond his years, provided a careful account of unfamiliar men who visited prior placements under the guise of administrative review. His recollections aligned with transaction dates in Grayson's report. There were no dramatic accusations, only quiet consistencies that strengthened the pattern. The risk to Ardelia expanded beyond market volatility. By challenging the network openly, she moved from peripheral disruption to direct opposition. Crown's public statements remained measured, denying misconduct while emphasizing charitable intent. Behind the scenes, legal pressure accelerated. Late in the week, formal notice arrived. Crown's legal team filed an emergency injunction asserting that Ardelia's guardianship status was procedurally invalid and requesting immediate transfer of the boys into state custody pending review. The courtroom carried a tension that did not rely on raised voices. It lived in posture, in stillness, in the careful way attorneys arranged their documents before speaking. The hearing would determine temporary guardianship of Silas and Micah, yet it felt larger than custody. It felt like a referendum on power, who could shape a child's future and call it lawful. Ardelia Vaughn entered without spectacle, dressed in measured simplicity that reflected neither wealth nor vulnerability. The opposing counsel framed the matter as procedural concern. They questioned her sudden involvement, her public statements, her financial capacity intersecting with a pending investigation. Motive became their focus. Was she protecting children or protecting her reputation? Was her transparency a shield crafted after exposure? Cross-examination pressed at the fault lines of her past. Her sealed records, now public, were recited with calculated neutrality. The voided guardianship transfer, the Foundation's petition, the years of silence that followed. The implication lingered that her current actions were driven by unresolved personal history rather than objective care. It was a subtle attempt to reframe conviction as instability. Outside the courthouse, national media gathered. Investigative journalists published parallel findings linking Crown's philanthropic network to multiple foster placements later flagged for irregular review. Missing case summaries resurfaced. Former administrators provided anonymized accounts of pressure to expedite transfers tied to private funding incentives. Public scrutiny intensified not through spectacle but through accumulation of fact. When Ardelia took the stand, her tone remained controlled, competitive in its clarity. She did not dramatize her childhood. She did not perform emotion. Instead, she outlined the structural mechanics uncovered through independent analysis, routing accounts, shell entities, incentive schedules disguised as administrative reimbursements. She described the sealed petition that once included her own name and explained how similar language appeared in the documentation tied to Silas and Micah. Her testimony did not accuse recklessly. It connected patterns methodically. The courtroom quieted not because she raised her voice, but because she did not. For the first time in her adult life, she fought for something that offered no financial return. Permanence had replaced profit as the objective. She understood that even victory might reduce her market influence, yet the calculation no longer centered on valuation. In the gallery, Silas watched without the guarded defiance that had defined his first days at the estate. His posture softened incrementally, as though the possibility of staying no longer felt not at v. Later that evening, Micah returned to his desk overlooking the garden and completed another drawing. The faceless outline now carried defined features, calm eyes, structured posture, unmistakably resembling Ardelia. The judge reserved final determination pending federal review. Hours after adjournment, news alerts interrupted regular programming. A sealed federal indictment had been issued in connection with an ongoing child placement investigation. Names were withheld, charges undisclosed. The sealed indictment did not remain sealed for long. Within days, federal authorities confirmed charges of trafficking, conspiracy, financial fraud, and unlawful guardianship facilitation against Ezekiel Crown and several affiliated executives within his foundation. The announcement unfolded without spectacle, yet its impact traveled swiftly through political and philanthropic circles. Crown's carefully maintained image as a benefactor of vulnerable communities dissolved under documented transaction trails and corroborated case files. What had operated behind polished mission statements collapsed under scrutiny. As investigators expanded their review, additional children were located and removed from questionable placements. Records once buried beneath administrative language surfaced with clarity. The network had relied on silence, on complexity, on the assumption that no one powerful enough would choose disruption over comfort. That assumption had proven flawed. For Ardelia Vaughn, vindication arrived without triumph. The courtroom granted permanent adoption of Silas and Micah after federal findings confirmed the risks embedded within their prior transfers. The legal declaration was concise, almost understated, yet its weight shifted the architecture of her life more profoundly than any acquisition contract she had signed. The boys no longer existed within provisional language. They belonged. The market response to her prolonged involvement had not been painless. Vanguard Neural Systems experienced volatility, and several board members resigned during the investigation's peak. Rather than retreat into damage control, Ardelia restructured the company into a public benefit corporation, embedding foster reform and child advocacy funding directly into its charter. Analysts debated the financial implications, yet the move reframed her leadership not as reactive philanthropy but as structural commitment. Inside the estate, change unfolded in quieter forms. Silas moved through hallways without calculating exit routes, his vigilance transformed into curiosity. Micah's sketchbooks filled with images of gardens, open doors, and faces drawn with intention rather than absence. The most recent drawing placed 3 figures on marble steps beneath an open sky, proportions steady and grounded. Ardelia understood the irony with clarity. For years, she treated wealth as insulation against uncertainty. Money built walls, secured influence, and minimized dependence. Now it functioned differently. It funded oversight committees, independent audits, and community placements monitored for integrity rather than profit. Strength no longer required detachment. It required decision, in honor of Talia Reed, whose disappearance remained under investigation, but whose sons now carried forward her name. Ardelia established the Reed Initiative, a national program designed to track private guardianship transfers and eliminate financial incentive structures that commodified vulnerability. The initiative did not erase loss, but it redirected consequence. One evening, months after the indictment, the 3 of them stood together on the same marble steps where an ordinary envelope once altered their trajectories. The property felt less like a fortress and more like a foundation. There were no camera crews, no legal observers, no pending transfers. Only presence. Later that night, security notified Ardelia of another envelope delivered at the gate. It contained no money, no threats. Inside was a handwritten list of names, children still unaccounted for within outdated placement records. If this story meant something to you, don't let it end here. There are conversations we avoid because they're uncomfortable. But those are the ones that change lives. Share this with someone who believes systems should protect the vulnerable, not profit from them. And if you want more stories that challenge power and protect truth, stay connected. Because in the end, the real question isn't whether Ardelia chose those boys, it's this: if someone once changed the course of your life without you even knowing, would you recognize the moment when it's finally your turn to do the same for someone else?